When you go to pick up the phone to call me to save you, that I'm going to be there?
I promise. I won't come
You're
to you.
more full of than a Christmas goose.
No.
Yes, you are. Everybody's got stress in their life. And then to say, I'm under stress, so I'm going to lie.
Are you going to be part of our lives or not?
Excuse me? You're going to give me the ultimate... Forrest?
Mom, accept this proposal or you're not a part of our lives.
You could hear a pin drop the moment Forrest looked his mother in the eye and told her, plain and simple, that if she couldn't accept Sheena, she might as well consider herself out of his life. The words hung in the air, heavy and electric, as if the whole room was holding its breath, waiting to see if Molly would explode or collapse. And then, like a storm breaking, Molly's face twisted with disbelief, her voice rising sharp and raw as she fired back with every ounce of control she'd ever wielded over her son. Forrest didn't flinch. Not this time. For the first time in his life, he stood his ground, and the shockwave from that moment rippled through everyone watching, leaving even Sheena speechless, her hand frozen halfway to Forrest's arm, unsure if she should comfort him or brace for impact. Welcome to 90 Day Scoop US. I'm Aliva, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time because you do not want to miss what happens next. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of family drama that splits opinions right down the middle. But how did we get here? Rewind just a few hours, and Forrest was still the same son who'd spent his whole life trying to keep the peace, tiptoeing around Molly's moods, always careful not to set her off. For years, he'd let her opinions shape his choices, her doubts cloud his confidence, her love come with strings so tight he could barely breathe. Molly wasn't just a mother, she was the sun around which Forrest's world revolved, and she made sure he never forgot it. Every decision, every relationship, every step forward had to pass through her filter first. And for a long time, Forrest played along, convincing himself that keeping his mother happy was the same as being happy himself. Then Sheena entered the picture, and everything changed. Sheena wasn't intimidated by Molly's sharp tongue or her icy stares. She saw the way Forrest shrank in his mother's presence, the way he second-guessed himself, and she started asking questions no one else dared to ask. Why did Molly get to decide who Forrest loved? Why did Forrest have to apologize for wanting something different? Sheena didn't just challenge Molly. She challenged Forrest to see himself as someone worthy of making his own choices, even if it meant disappointing the one person he'd spent his whole life trying to please. The closer Forrest and Sheena grew, the more Molly tightened her grip. She started picking apart every detail of their relationship, questioning Sheena's motives, digging up old mistakes, and warning Forrest that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Forrest tried to keep the peace, tried to reassure his mother that nothing would change. But the truth was, everything was changing. For the first time, Forrest was starting to imagine a future that didn't revolve around Molly's approval, and that terrified her more than anything. So when Forrest finally dropped the ultimatum, it wasn't just a fight about Sheena. It was a fight about every moment Molly had ever tried to control, every boundary she'd ever crossed, every time Forrest had swallowed his own needs to keep her happy. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as Molly's anger boiled over, her words coming faster, louder, desperate to pull Forrest back into line. But Forrest didn't budge. He stood there, steady, his voice calm but unyielding, and for the first time, Molly realized she might actually lose him. What happens to a family when the person who's always been in charge suddenly finds herself powerless? What happens when the child who's always obeyed finally says no? The stakes couldn't be higher. If Forrest stands his ground, he risks losing the only family he's ever known. If he backs down, he loses himself. And Sheena, caught in the middle, knows that no matter what happens, nothing will ever be the same again. The fallout from this moment is coming. And nobody, not Forrest, not Molly, not Sheena, will escape unchanged. Forrest didn't grow up with the kind of freedom most kids take for granted. From the time he could walk, Molly was there, hovering, correcting, making sure every step he took was the right one. Her version of right, anyway. She called it love, but it felt more like a leash, one that got shorter every year. Family dinners weren't just meals, they were performance reviews. If Forrest brought home a B instead of an A, Molly would sigh and remind him how much she'd sacrificed. If he wanted to join a club or hang out with friends, she'd ask a dozen questions, then remind him how dangerous the world could be. Even as an adult, Forrest couldn't shake the feeling that every choice he made was being graded, and the only passing score was total obedience. On camera, Molly's control came wrapped in concern. She'd say things like, "I'm only hard on you because I care," or, "You know I just want what's best for you." But the subtext was always clear. If Forrest stepped out of line, he'd pay for it with guilt, silence, or a cold shoulder that could last for days. Viewers saw it in the way she interrupted him, finished his sentences, or dismissed his opinions with a wave of her hand. When Forrest tried to explain his feelings, Molly would cut him off, insisting she knew him better than he knew himself. Even in public, she'd make little digs about his choices, always with a smile, as if it was all a joke. But Forrest never laughed. Inside, Forrest was torn in two. Part of him still craved his mother's approval, that warm feeling he got when she was proud of him, even if it was rare. But another part, the part that had grown louder since meeting Sheena, wanted something different. He wanted to make his own mistakes, to choose his own path, even if it meant stumbling. The guilt was crushing. Every time he thought about pushing back, he'd hear Molly's voice in his head, warning him about ungrateful children and broken families. But then he'd look at Sheena, see the way she believed in him, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, he deserved more than a life spent chasing someone else's approval. Sheena saw through Molly's act from the start. She'd grown up with her own share of family drama, so she recognized the signs, the backhanded compliments, the subtle digs, the way Molly would turn every conversation into a test. Sheena tried to win Molly over at first, going out of her way to be polite, helpful, even deferential. But nothing worked. Molly's distrust ran deep, and it wasn't just about Sheena's past. Sure, Sheena had made mistakes, who hasn't? But Molly latched on to every misstep, blowing them up into proof that Sheena was a threat. The lies Molly kept bringing up weren't even about Forrest. They were about old wounds, things Sheena had done to survive, things she'd already owned up to. But in Molly's eyes, any flaw was unforgivable, especially if it meant losing her grip on Forrest. The real story behind the trauma was messier than Molly wanted to admit. Sheena had been through things that left scars, and sometimes those scars showed up as secrets or half-truths. She wasn't perfect, but she was honest about her struggles, and she wanted to move forward. Molly, though, used Sheena's past as ammunition, twisting every confession into a weapon. She'd say she was protecting Forrest, but it felt more like she was protecting her own sense of control. Was it love? Or was it fear of being left behind? That's the question that hung over every interaction, every argument, every tense family dinner. Was Molly's protectiveness really about Forrest's happiness, or was it about keeping him close, no matter the cost? And if Forrest finally broke free, would Molly let him go, or would she fight even harder to pull him back? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. The leash was tightening, and something had to give. The moment Forrest announced his engagement to Sheena, the air in the room changed. It wasn't excitement or joy that filled the space, it was a tension so thick you could almost taste it. Forrest's voice trembled just a little as he said the words, but he looked at Sheena with a kind of hope that made it clear this was his choice, not anyone else's. For a split second, there was silence, the kind that makes your heart pound in your ears. Then, Molly's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as if she'd been waiting for this exact betrayal. She didn't even try to hide her anger. Instead, she let it spill out, sharp and cold. Her words slicing through the moment like a knife. Sheena, sensing the storm, tried to keep things calm. She reached for Molly, offering a smile that was equal parts nervous and sincere, saying she wanted everyone to be happy, that she hoped they could move forward as a family. But Molly wasn't having it. She shot back with a sarcastic laugh, rolling her eyes and muttering about forgiveness and second chances as if the very idea was a joke. Sheena's hand dropped, her smile fading. But she didn't back down. She tried again, explaining that she knew she'd made mistakes, that she was working to be better, that she loved Forrest and wanted to earn Molly's trust. But every word seemed to make Molly angrier, her voice rising as she accused Sheena of manipulation, of lying, of trying to steal her son away. Forrest stood between them, feeling the weight of both women's expectations pressing down on him. He could see the pain in Sheena's eyes, the way she shrank under Molly's glare, and it made his chest ache. But he could also feel the old pull of loyalty to his mother, the fear that if he pushed too hard, he'd lose her forever. Molly saw that fear and used it, her words turning from anger to guilt in a heartbeat. She reminded Forrest of everything she'd done for him, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every time she'd picked him up when he fell. She painted herself as the victim, the mother who only wanted what was best, and Forrest as the ungrateful son who was throwing it all away for a woman he barely knew. The emotional stakes couldn't have been higher. Forrest's hands shook as he tried to reason with Molly, telling her that he loved her, that he didn't want to lose her, but that he also loved Sheena and wanted to build a life with her. Molly scoffed, accusing him of being blinded by infatuation, of letting Sheena pull the strings. She warned him that he'd regret this, that Sheena would hurt him, that he'd come crawling back when it all fell apart. Forrest's patience, already worn thin by years of walking on eggshells, started to crack. He raised his voice, something he almost never did, telling Molly that he was an adult, that he deserved to make his own choices even if they weren't perfect. But Molly wasn't listening. She doubled down, her sarcasm turning cruel, her guilt tripping relentless. She painted Sheena as a liar, Forrest as a fool, and herself as the only one who truly cared. Sheena, for her part, stood her ground, refusing to let Molly's words define her. But the hurt was clear on her face. Forrest looked from one woman to the other, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew something had to give. Would he finally snap and put his foot down? Or would the pressure be too much, forcing him to back down once again? The answer hung in the air, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the stalemate. Forrest's voice cut through the chaos, steady but shaking with the weight of everything he'd held back for years. He looked straight at Molly, his jaw set, and told her this was it. Either she accepted Sheena as part of his life, or she would have to accept not being in it at all. The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls and landing like a slap. For a moment, Molly just stared at him, her mouth open, as if she couldn't believe her son had finally drawn a line she couldn't erase. Then, the dam broke. Molly's anger erupted, her voice rising and falling in waves, accusations flying faster than Forrest could answer. She called Sheena a manipulator, a liar, someone who would ruin Forrest's life and leave him broken. She painted herself as the only one who truly cared, the only one who'd ever been there for him, and now he was throwing her away for a woman who, in her words, didn't deserve him. She didn't stop there. Molly's words twisted, turning from anger to heartbreak and back again, her tone shifting from wounded mother to furious judge. She reminded Forrest of every time she'd picked him up, every sacrifice she'd made, every moment she'd put his needs before her own. She accused him of being ungrateful, of betraying her, of choosing a stranger over his own blood. The guilt dripped from every sentence, each one designed to pull Forrest back, to make him question himself, to make him feel small. But Forrest didn't back down. He stood his ground, repeating his ultimatum, his voice growing stronger with every word. He told Molly he loved her, but he couldn't let her control his life anymore. He needed to make his own choices, even if they hurt. Sheena, standing quietly beside Forrest, didn't flinch. She listened to Molly's tirade, her face calm but her eyes shining with emotion. When Molly turned on her, accusing her of lying and manipulating Forrest, Sheena didn't argue or raise her voice. Instead, she admitted her past mistakes, explained her trauma, and promised to keep working on herself. She didn't beg for forgiveness or try to win Molly over with empty promises. She simply stood her ground, owning her story and refusing to let Molly's words define her. But Molly wasn't interested in explanations. She waved off Sheena's honesty, insisting it was all an act. Another trick to get what she wanted. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as the confrontation dragged on. Forrest's hands shook, but he didn't waver. He knew this was a turning point, a moment he couldn't walk back from. Molly's words cut deep, but for the first time, they didn't break him. He looked at Sheena, saw the strength in her eyes, and realized he wasn't alone. Still, the fallout from this showdown was impossible to ignore. Would Forrest be able to handle the consequences of standing up to his mother? Or would Molly's words haunt him, pulling him back into old patterns? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The door closed behind Forrest and Sheena with a finality that felt like the end of an era. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of Molly's uneven breathing as she stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space where her son had just been. Forrest didn't look back. He walked out with Sheena at his side, his steps heavy, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation drained away, leaving him raw and exposed. He tried to focus on Sheena's hand in his, the steady comfort of her presence, but the ache in his chest wouldn't let up. Was this what freedom felt like? Or was it just another kind of loss? Outside, Forrest struggled to catch his breath. The reality of what he'd done hit him all at once. He'd stood up to his mother, drawn a line she couldn't cross, and now he was on the other side of it, unsure if he'd ever be able to go back. The grief was sharp, almost physical, as he realized he might have lost his mother for good. Every memory of her, good and bad, flashed through his mind in a blur. The birthday parties she'd planned, the late-night talks, the way she'd always been there when he was sick or scared, but also the criticism, the guilt, the way she'd made him feel small when he wanted to be himself. He wondered if Sheena could ever fill that void, if anyone could. Sheena squeezed his hand, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, but Forrest couldn't find the words to tell her what he was feeling. He wanted to be strong for her, to show her that he didn't regret his choice, but the truth was, he was scared. Scared of what he'd lost, and scared of what came next. Back inside, Molly was unraveling. She paced the room, her anger simmering just beneath the surface, her heartbreak spilling over in waves. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, picking apart every word, every look, every moment when she could have said something different. Part of her wanted to believe she was the victim, the mother who'd only ever wanted the best for her son, now abandoned for a woman she barely knew. But another part, the part she tried to ignore, wondered if she'd pushed too hard, held on too tight, refused to see Forrest as anything other than her little boy. The denial was easier. She told herself Forrest would come back, that he'd realize his mistake, that Sheena would show her true colors and he'd need his mother again. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her, whispering that maybe this time she'd gone too far. The fallout wasn't just about one fight or one ultimatum. It was about years of patterns, years of love tangled up with control, years of never quite letting go. Forrest and Sheena walked away together, but the question hung in the air. What happens when a parent refuses to let go? Does the family break apart for good? Or is there a way back from the edge? The answer was still out there, waiting, as everyone tried to figure out what came next. News travels fast in families like Forrest's, and it didn't take long for the shockwaves to hit every corner of their world. Dev was the first to weigh in, his reaction a mix of disbelief and awkward humor, trying to lighten the mood but only making the tension more obvious. He told Forrest he'd never seen Molly so rattled, that she'd always been the one calling the shots, and now it looked like the whole script had flipped. Other relatives chimed in, some quietly supporting Forrest's right to make his own choices, others whispering that he'd gone too far, that no matter how tough things got, you never turn your back on your mother. The family group chat lit up with messages, some sympathetic, some judgmental, All of them proof that this wasn't just a private fight anymore. It was a public spectacle. Social media picked up the scent almost instantly. Clips of the confrontation started circulating, with viewers taking sides in the comments. Some called Molly overbearing, saying it was about time Forrest stood up for himself. Others saw her as a mother pushed to her limit, heartbroken by a son who'd chosen a partner over his own blood. Hashtags trended, debates raged, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about who was right and who was wrong. Forrest scrolled through the posts late at night, the words blurring together, each one adding another layer to the guilt and doubt already weighing him down. He wondered if he'd made a mistake, if he'd been too harsh, if there was a way to fix things without giving up the life he wanted with Sheena. The pressure didn't let up. Every time Forrest tried to move forward, he felt the pull of the past, the ache of what he'd left behind. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, second-guessing every word, every decision. The guilt was relentless, a constant reminder that no matter how right his choice felt in the moment, it came with a cost he hadn't fully counted on. Sheena did her best to support him, offering comfort and reassurance, reminding him that he deserved to live his own life. But even she couldn't hide her own insecurities. She worried that Forrest would start to resent her, that he'd blame her for the rift with his mother, that their relationship would buckle under the weight of so much family drama. They tried to keep things normal, to focus on their future together, but the tension was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Every conversation felt loaded, every decision a test of their strength as a couple. Forrest wanted to believe they could weather the storm, but the doubts crept in late at night, when the house was quiet and the only thing left was the echo of Molly's words. Was he strong enough to hold the line, or would the guilt pull him back? Would Sheena's love be enough to fill the space his mother had left behind, or would the cracks start to show? The question lingered, unanswered, as Forrest stared at his phone, wondering if he should reach out to Molly, or if this really was the end of their story. Forrest lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying scenes from a childhood that now felt both distant and painfully close. He remembered the way Molly used to tuck him in at night, her voice soft as she promised to keep him safe from anything that might hurt him. He remembered the birthday cakes she baked from scratch, the way she cheered the loudest at every school play, the pride in her eyes when he brought home a good report card. But those memories tangled with others, the time she'd scolded him for wanting something different, the way she dismissed his dreams as childish, the silent treatment that followed every disagreement. Forrest realized that love and control had always been two sides of the same coin in his family, and now he was left wondering if he'd ever really known the difference. He tried to make sense of it all, searching for the moment when things had shifted from care to control, from guidance to suffocation. Was it when he started dating, when he first brought Sheena home, or had it always been there, hidden beneath the surface? The guilt gnawed at him, but so did a new sense of clarity. For the first time, he saw that wanting his own life didn't make him a bad son, it made him human. Still, the ache of missing his mother was real, and he wondered if she was lying awake too, replaying the same memories, feeling the same loss. Molly sat alone in her kitchen, the house too quiet, her phone silent. She scrolled through old photos, her finger pausing on pictures of Forrest as a little boy, his smile wide, his eyes bright. She felt the sting of regret, but it was tangled up with anger and pride. Part of her wanted to call him, to apologize, to say she'd gone too far. But another part, the part that had always believed she knew best, told her to stand firm. She told herself she was protecting him, that one day he'd thank her for not letting him make a mistake. But as the hours dragged on, doubt crept in. Had she pushed him away for good? Was she the villain in a story she'd always thought she was writing as the hero? Sheena watched Forrest struggle, her heart breaking for him, but she refused to let him face it alone. She stood by him, offering comfort, encouragement, and a quiet strength that steadied him when he faltered. But the cost was real. Sheena felt the weight of Molly's disapproval, the sting of being cast as the outsider, the fear that no matter how hard she tried, she'd never be enough to heal the rift. She wondered if loving Forrest meant always living in the shadow of his mother, always fighting for a place in his life. Still, she stayed, determined to build something new, even if it meant letting go of the hope that Molly would ever accept her. The question hung over all of them, heavy and unresolved. Could forgiveness ever happen? Or had too much been said? Too many lines crossed? Was there a way back from this? Or was the damage permanent? The answer was still out of reach, but the longing for peace, for understanding, for a second chance, lingered in every quiet moment, every unspoken word, every memory that refused to fade. Forrest stood at the edge of his own future, feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on him. The phone sat on the table, Molly's number glowing on the screen, her last message unread but impossible to ignore. He knew what she wanted. One more chance to talk, one more plea for him to come home, to make things right by her definition. The ache in his chest was sharp, a mix of longing and dread, because he missed his mother. But he also knew that going back would mean giving up the hard-won freedom he'd finally tasted. Every memory of their last fight replayed in his mind, the words they'd thrown at each other, the tears in Molly's eyes, the way Sheena had squeezed his hand, silently urging him to stand strong. Molly's voice on the other end was softer than he expected, almost pleading. She told him she loved him, that she only wanted what was best, that she couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. She asked him to come over, to talk face to face, to remember the bond they'd always shared. But beneath the warmth, Forrest heard the old patterns, the subtle guilt, the reminders of everything she'd done for him, the fear that he was slipping away for good. He felt himself pulled in two directions, the old loyalty battling with the new sense of self he'd started to build. He wanted to believe they could find a middle ground, that love didn't have to mean surrender, but every word from Molly felt like a test he was destined to fail. Sheena watched him struggle, her own heart caught in the crossfire. She wanted peace, wanted Forrest to have the family he deserved, but she also knew what it had cost him to finally stand up for himself. She offered to go with him, to help bridge the gap, but Forrest shook his head. This was something he had to do alone. He promised her he wouldn't let anyone come between them, not even his mother, but Sheena could see the doubt in his eyes. She wondered if she was the reason for the rift, if loving Forrest meant always being the wedge that kept him from the family he'd once called home. The meeting with Molly was quieter than their last encounter, but no less charged. She tried to hold his hand to remind him of the little boy who used to run to her for comfort, but Forrest pulled away, gently but firmly. He told her he loved her, that he always would, but he couldn't keep living his life for her approval. He needed to make his own choices, to build something real with Sheena, even if it meant letting go of the past. Molly's tears came then, silent and bitter, as she realized she couldn't change his mind. She begged him to reconsider, to think about everything they'd shared. But Forrest stood his ground. He promised to stay in touch, to keep the door open, but only if she could accept his boundaries. As he walked away, Forrest felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the wounds between him and Molly might never fully heal. But for the first time, he felt like his life was truly his own. Sheena was waiting for him, her arms open, her eyes shining with pride and love. Forrest chose autonomy, chose to move forward, even if it meant leaving some things behind. The old patterns were broken, and in their place was the hope of something new. A future built on honesty, respect, and the courage to choose his own path. Time moved differently after the dust settled. Forrest and Sheena found themselves in a quieter world, one where every day felt like a test of their resolve, but also a chance to breathe without the constant pressure of someone else's expectations. Their apartment was still filled with the echoes of recent arguments and the uncertainty of what came next, but there was also a new sense of peace. Forrest woke up each morning with a little less weight on his chest, a little more confidence in his own choices. He and Sheena started making plans for their future. Small things at first, like picking out new furniture together or cooking dinner without worrying about who might disapprove. They talked about trips they wanted to take, dreams they'd put on hold, and the kind of family they wanted to build, one where love didn't come with conditions. Molly, on the other hand, struggled with the silence that filled her house. The routines she'd built around Forrest's life were suddenly empty, and she found herself reaching for her phone only to stop short, unsure of what to say. She replayed their last conversation over and over, searching for a way she could have changed the outcome. Some days, her anger flared up again, convincing her that she'd been right to stand her ground. Other days, the loneliness crept in, and she wondered if holding on so tightly had cost her the one thing she'd always claimed to protect. Friends and relatives offered advice, some urging her to reach out, others telling her to wait for Forrest to come back. But Molly knew things would never return to the way they were. The control she'd once wielded so easily had become a wall, and now she was the one on the outside looking in. Forrest learned that boundaries weren't just about saying no, they were about saying yes to himself, to his own needs and happiness. He realized that independence wasn't a betrayal, but a necessary step toward becoming the person he wanted to be. The cost of control he saw now was higher than he'd ever imagined. It had strained every relationship, turned love into a battleground, and left scars that would take time to heal. But there was relief too, in knowing he'd finally stood up for himself, in seeing Sheena's unwavering support, in feeling the beginnings of hope for a future that was truly his own. Sadness lingered, especially in the quiet moments when Forrest thought about the mother he'd lost, or at least the version of her he'd always hoped to have. But hope grew stronger with each day that passed, each small victory, each moment of laughter with Sheena that felt free from judgment. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but they were building something real, something that belonged to them alone. Then, one evening, as Forrest and Sheena sat together planning their next step, Forrest's phone buzzed with a message from Molly. It was short, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of everything left unsaid. She wrote that she missed him, that she hoped he was happy, and that maybe, when he was ready, they could talk. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a surrender, but it was a crack in the wall. A sign that, even after everything, reconciliation might still be possible. Forrest read the message twice, his heart pounding, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself believe that healing could start with something as simple as a few honest words. As Forrest stared at Molly's message, the possibilities stretched out in front of him, both hopeful and uncertain. Would he answer right away, or let the silence linger a little longer? Would Molly truly accept his boundaries, or would old habits creep back in when they finally spoke? And what about Sheena? Could she trust that this new chapter wouldn't pull Forrest back into the same patterns that nearly broke them? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as Forrest and Sheena faced a future that was theirs to shape, but still shadowed by the past. But family drama never really ends, does it? Even as Forrest and Sheena tried to move forward, new challenges waited just around the corner. There were wedding plans to navigate, relatives with opinions louder than ever, and the constant pressure of living their lives in the public eye. Would Molly show up at the engagement party? Or would she send another message from afar? Would Forrest's decision inspire other family members to break free from old patterns? Or would it spark even more conflict? And what about Sheena's own family? Were they ready to accept Forrest? Or was another storm brewing on the horizon? If you think the story is finished, think again. The next chapter is already unfolding, with secrets, surprises, and more tough choices waiting for everyone involved. If you want to see what happens when old wounds meet new beginnings, and how Forrest and Sheena handle the next round of family fireworks, you won't want to miss what's coming up. Stick around for the next episode, because in this family, the drama is never really over. It's only getting started.